Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Ghostbusters 2, brought to us by Activision. Of course, based on the hit sequel, Ghostbusters 2, this game is actually a lot better than the original NES game based on Ghostbusters 1. This version by Activision is actually also the only version of the game that was released. While Ghostbusters 1 on NES was released on multiple home platforms developed by different developers, this is the only version of this game that came out. And while it is better than the original, it still has some problems with its controls and overall gameplay that still makes it a rather bland experience overall. So here we go with Ghostbusters 2 for the NES. At the startup screen, you can actually play the game 1 or 2 players, where you'll be alternating in each level, and once you start up the game you get a brief story sequence telling you about Vigo, the Scourge of the Carpathia, who's trying to resurrect himself. Our goal in the game is of course to prevent him from being able to do so. As you can see right at the start, the graphics are a lot more colorful and detailed, as well as we can actually use our proton pack to fire in all directions. Of course, since Ghostbusters 2 features more of slime than the actual proton beam, we'll be using slime as our main weapon throughout this game. You can fire in all directions, though it is a little bit tricky to get used to, as you actually have to move the beam up and down into the correct spot. It can't automatically go there instantly. Most enemies only take a single shot or a few shots to take out here in the first level, and you can also shoot at the Ghostbusters logos, which counts as kind of the bonus points for this game. Collecting 20 of the Ghostbusters logo will grant you an extra life. The second level of the game has us in the Ghostbuster vehicle as we're trying to travel down the streets firing at ghosts. You can once again collect Ghostbusters logo along the way, as well as fire at all the ghosts in front of you. Do your best to dodge over all the projectiles that the ghosts may shoot out at you, as well as the barriers that are there across the street. Be sure not to run over the manhole covers, because slime will fly out of it when you go over it. You'll have to hit the arrows before you get to one of the big jumps, so it propels you all the way over the gap and you can make it over. You can also get a few upgrades during this stage by attacking things above you, in which case you can power up the gun to make it a little bit stronger, as well as you may be able to get a bomb which will destroy all enemies on screen. However, they're really not necessary, and you shouldn't have too much trouble making it through the level anyway. The third level has us in the Courthouse, and it's the first time on the NES where we actually get to play as Winston. This level definitely has a few more harder enemies to deal with, especially with the Kool-Aid pitchers as well as the gavels that are going to try to hit you. Just keep moving to the left and firing pretty much in an up-left diagonal direction to hit most of the enemies, while you'll be able to jump over the other ones that are closer to the ground. For the big ghost, you'll actually have to use one of your Ghostbusters traps to take out, or you can just run past them like I do here. Though later on in the game, it's much more suggested that you actually use the Ghostbusters trap, because you can actually get 2 or 3 of the giant ghosts on screen at once. The next level, we're traveling once again on the streets for the second and last driving section of the game. This one's definitely a little bit tougher because the area of the road is a little bit smaller, and there seems to be more enemies during this section. If you're having trouble, be sure to shoot the giant slimes above you so you can try to get the power-ups, or just keep using your normal fire to take out the little ghost on the street. Since the Ghostbusters vehicle has the option of jumping, you should be able to actually jump over all the projectiles as well as easily get over all the barricades. The hardest part about these stages by far is just hitting the arrows at the right times to make it over the large gaps. It can be a little bit tricky, and the game can have some problems, and you'll end up falling into some of the pits sometimes even when you hit the arrows, so it takes a little bit of practice. Next up, we get to play as my favorite Ghostbuster, Egon, as we're traveling in the subway system. Since the Courthouse had gavels flying at you, you now have different whistles and other things related to trains as you travel through here. However, it's pretty much the same deal. Just be careful and don't go underneath the enemies if they're about to fall down on you, as well as jump over the ones that come straight at you. Just like we did before, shoot at the normal ghosts and use your trap if you need to take out the bigger ghosts when they appear. Next up is probably the most iconic scene from the movie, and that's when the Ghostbusters take control of the Statue of Liberty and use it in order to open up the museum where Vigo is located. This is a completely different style of gameplay overall, reminiscent of a scrolling shooter, as you have tons of different enemies that are going to be trying to hit you during this section. The Statue of Liberty can fire out of the torch, and you can actually move the torch once you upgrade it, so you can fire in multiple directions. You're going to be looking out for the green torches to upgrade the torch, as well as you can actually get book bombs to destroy all enemies on screen, as well as you can actually get invincibility during this section. While this is probably the funnest section of the entire game, it gets pretty boring because it's actually the longest level of the game. Over half the game is contained within this level and the next stage, which is also another Statue of Liberty level. After destroying enough enemies, you'll get a bonus round where you'll be able to shoot at a whole bunch of the Ghostbuster logos. The Statue of Liberty itself can take only a few hits before you end up losing a life, so try to do your best to learn the patterns of the different types of ghosts so you can easily hit them and also dodge at the same time. As you can see, these ones jump out of the water like dolphins, so you have to wait for them to jump up into the air and hit them as they're arcing back down. Like I mentioned before about the bonus rounds, you'll be seeing a ton of them throughout this area because you'll keep getting them over and over again. A lot of the enemies in this segment will actually come at you in straight lines, as you can see with some of these ghosts storing here. Don't feel too bad if you end up getting hit a few times, as the meter to the left of the clock in the lower right corner will signify how much health you have left. Every time you get slimed, it'll fill up with a little bit of white. Once it fully fills up, then you end up losing a life. While this was the only version of Ghostbusters 2 released for the NES in North America, there actually was another Ghostbusters 2 game for NES. It was called the New Ghostbusters 2, and it was only released in PAL territories, but due to the fact that Activision had the rights for NES and other Ghostbusters-related games in North America, they couldn't port the game over. So unfortunately, we in North America got stuck with this version of the game, where Europe actually got to choose between the two titles. After traveling through New York Harbor for a long period of time fighting a lot of different ghosts, we get a time rack up at the bottom of the screen, and then we move on to the next level. Now we're in Manhattan itself, and as you can see, the level has changed up. We now have buildings in the foreground and background, as well as the enemies have changed up. We now have storm clouds overhead firing down lightning bolts at us. So you're going to find yourself getting hit a lot more in this level than you did in the previous level, and even though they are lightning bolts, you're still going to get slimed, as you'll say at the bottom of the screen. However, for the most part, it remains the same overall gameplay, so you'll be finding yourself getting the invincibilities as well as the bonus stages throughout this level. After the lightning clouds have dissipated for a period of time, you'll now actually be fighting the ghosts again. These ghosts move a lot more sporadically. As you can see, they move in circular patterns as they work their way down the screen. Either stay away from them altogether, or just try to attack them when they're at the height, so you don't end up getting hit by them as they circle down to the ground. If you did find yourself getting really bored the first level of this area, you'll definitely get bored by the time you make it to this section. I do find it funny that not only do you have ghosts fighting you that are pretty stereotypical looking, you also have skeletons that'll start flying through the air as well as normal enemies during this segment. The other Ghostbusters 2 games that were available in North America, mainly for home computer consoles at the time, are actually an overall funner experience, so I highly recommend, if you can, check out either the Commodore 64 version or probably the Amiga version of the game if possible. Those games actually use pictures from the film as well as have an overall better gameplay experience. And I have one last thing to talk about as far as Ghostbusters games go. For the Game Boy, there's a Ghostbusters game called The Real Ghostbusters, based on the cartoon series that was released. However, in other territories, that same game was actually released as different properties. For example, in North America, it was The Real Ghostbusters, but in Japan, it was actually released as a Mickey Mouse title, whereas Europe, it was actually released as a Garfield title. And you may ask, how can that game be released with all those different properties while actually using all those properties correctly? And the real answer is, it really doesn't. The game is actually kind of a puzzle game where you're breaking blocks either using a magic wand for Mickey or the proton pack if you're a Ghostbuster. I do apologize for how boring this level ends up being to watch, but there really isn't anything you can do to speed it up. The best strategy is just learning the patterns of the different ghosts so you can easily take them out or dodge them, as well as try to do your best and have fun by collecting all the Ghostbuster symbols and seeing how many lives you can rack up. And in the end, though, it's actually a good thing to rack up lives because the final level of the game ends up being a lot tougher than this one. After traveling through New York for what feels like a century, we finally get a time bonus at the bottom and move on to the museum, the final level of the game. As you can see, the museum level is like the other previous levels of the game. However, there's a lot more stuff flying at you and a lot more ghosts to deal with. Also, the thing about this, instead of going from right to left just one time, you actually have to get all 4 Ghostbusters from the right to the left, and every Ghostbuster has to deal with different enemy placements as well as different hazards to deal with. Getting through it the first time isn't too much tougher than some of the previous levels like the sewer system or the courthouse. Just be careful that you don't get hit by the rocking items that go back and forth as they move their way up and down. Be very careful of the 2 candles at the end, and then complete the segment where you get to see the Ghostbuster you just moved over there spray the Vigo painting with some slime. Next up we have Winston, and this area is definitely tougher than the first one. Be careful and just wait for these bouncing items to come near you and then quickly run underneath them when you get an opportune time. Also, be very careful of flying objects that are going to be flying towards you at the bottom of the screen. They come at you pretty fast, so I recommend just slowly moving along the bottom your first few times, and just try to get each item to come at you one at a time instead of all in one big bunch. Be careful of the giant ghost and use your traps if you need to, and once Winston gets there, he once again hits Vigo with some slime. We now take the control of Egon as we make our way through it for the 3rd time. Just like in previous levels, for the most part, I keep my blaster towards the ceiling or just slightly left diagonally, to easily hit the enemies while I'm moving in between all the candlesticks as well as the statues during this segment. Since it's really tough to deal with 2 of the giant ghosts at one time, here's a good opportunity to use one of your traps. You do have an unlimited amount of them and they can take out all enemies, so you really don't have to be worried about using them, though I think it adds a nice little extra challenge to the game if you can actually make it through the segments without using those Ghostbuster traps. For our final trip through the museum, we actually get to play as Peter for the first time in the game. This is definitely the toughest part of the entire game, and there's a lot of enemies flying at you and a lot of statues trying to get rid of you. Definitely use your Ghostbusters traps to your advantage and just take it very slowly to try to force those statues to fly at you at 1 or 2 at a time instead of all together. Sometimes with 3 of the bouncing statues coming at you at once, you just have to keep moving backwards for the right opportunity, and as soon as you see it, you have to immediately take it. However, when you make it to the end as Peter, you get to sit back and enjoy the short ending. And there you have it, you get your final score as well as to end the game. After that, the game goes back up to the start and you can play the game all over again. But with that, that's going to wrap up this edition of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.